Hello, Rams, and welcome to another exciting episode of Rams History. Today's topic will be the scientific revolution. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when you think about the scientific revolution, please keep in mind that it's kind of like that Facebook relationship status. It's complicated. It's a little bit difficult to kind of talk about this time period because not all of the knowledge being discussed was new. In fact, some of it was actually ancient or medieval knowledge that was being re-examined. Some of it was, in fact, new knowledge that was being discovered for the first time. Now, something else to keep in mind is that this was a largely informal movement. The idea of a scientist was really not invented yet. In fact, the word scientist wouldn't come into common usage until the middle part of the 19th century. This was also very much a small movement. It only involved a few hundred people who tended to be very elite, and it was certainly something that didn't happen rapidly. The scientific revolution was a very slow process. However, although it was informal and rather slow and rather complex, it was very effective because by the end of the 17th century, science had sort of become the new standard by which knowledge would be assessed. And in fact, by today, in the early 21st century, science has really become a defining characteristic of the Western world in terms of how we examine new knowledge and learn about the world around us. So although the scientific revolution is a bit hard to describe, it was very effective in its results. Now, really, astronomy was the first area in which the scientific revolution was strongly felt. Now, the old system was the Ptolemaic system. This was a system going back to the ancient Greeks, and it was this concept of what was called a geocentric universe, right? Essentially, the Earth was the center of the universe, and everything sort of revolved around it. The beauty of this system is that it was very much in line with biblical teachings and church teachings. After all, if God created the earth, then the earth must be the center of the universe. Now, the problem with the Ptolemaic system is that it didn't really jive with what people were seeing. People were looking at the universe and they were looking at the movement of the planets, and they really didn't line up with sort of the system described by Ptolemy. So although this was the system that was generally accepted for centuries and commonly used, there were many who had trouble with it. So along comes Nicholas Copernicus, and he spends a good deal of time looking at the heavens, and he begins to develop this concept of a heliocentric universe. Copernicus writes a book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, and in this book he's talking about this idea that the sun is in fact the center of the universe and not the earth. Now, this concept of a heliocentric universe was very controversial, and in fact Copernicus did not really replace the idea of a geocentric universe for quite some time. People continued to believe in the Ptolemaic system. Copernicus, really what he had done was provided sort of an alternative, a possible different theory. Although many people regarded the concept of a heliocentric universe as somewhat bizarre and perhaps even heretical, Copernicus was really the first to promote this idea that the sun was in fact the center of the universe and not the earth. So a couple gentlemen come along which really kind of build upon Copernicus's theory. Now, Tycho Brahe was a Dutch mathematician and astronomer. Not necessarily the nicest of people. He had quite a wild reputation. But he did spend many, many hours observing the heavens. Now, he was not necessarily a big fan of Copernicus. He really didn't embrace Copernican theories. But in his observations, he made a vast amount of data that would later be used by his assistant, Johann Kepler. Kepler was apparently one of the few people who could actually get along with Brahe. And after Brahe's death, Kepler inherited all of his data and observations. And Kepler begins to use these numbers to actually support Copernicus's theory. Kepler was a big fan of Copernicus, believed in his theories, and actually found that Brahe's observations backed up an awful lot of what Copernicus was saying. Now, Kepler's big contribution is this discovery that the orbit of the planets is in fact elliptical and not circular. This was one of the big problems with Copernican theory, is sort of the mathematics didn't work out. But when Kepler allows for elliptical orbits, then suddenly everything kind of fell into place. So Brahe is not necessarily a fan of Copernicus, but his observations will later be used by Kepler, in fact, to kind of reinforce the concept of a heliocentric universe with elliptical orbits. And then, of course, along comes Galileo. Now, there's a lot of misunderstandings about Galileo. He did not, in fact, invent the telescope or anything like that. However, Galileo was one of the first to actually point a telescope at the heavens, and he made a great deal of very detailed observations. He looked at the surface of the moon, and he saw mountains and valleys. He looked at the moons of Jupiter, in fact, for the first time, which he actually named after the children of his Medici patron. And because he worked for the Medici, they were his patrons, he was a leading figure in kind of making Copernican ideas popular. So really, Galileo is more of a promoter than anything else. He's kind of this guy who takes the theory of Copernicus and really kind of gets it into the mainstream. That's really sort of his big contribution here. And really, thanks to Galileo, one of the trends that really begins to appear in Western civilization is this concept of sort of a mathematical ordered universe. We begin to look at the universe and the world as being governed by mathematical principles. And in fact, mathematical principles will even later be applied to things like human relations. Now today, here in the Western world, we really kind of use mathematical laws as a way of ordering our world and ordering our universe. It's sort of mathematics and science very much go hand in hand. So Galileo is among the first to really popularize this concept of a universe running according to mathematical principles. And of course, we cannot really discuss mathematics without discussing Sir Isaac Newton. Now, Newton is a guy who kind of takes the concept of Kepler and Galileo a little bit further. Kepler, of course, describes elliptical orbits in the planets, but what Kepler really wasn't sure about was why the planets did what they did. He was able to describe what they were doing, but he really wasn't too sure why. Now, Newton comes along, and he's kind of the father of physics and things like that. And Newton is the one who first describes the concept of gravity. Now, what Newton was talking about here, of course, was this idea of attraction. No, not this kind of attraction, although they are a lovely couple. What Newton was talking about is that the planets were attracted to each other by gravity, and this is why they moved in the orbits in which they moved, because essentially they were pulling on each other and things like that through gravity. So Newton really kind of helps to make the heliocentric universe concept even more popular because he offers an explanation for why the planets were behaving as the way they did. Now, of course, we get to this concept of what is called empiricism. Empiricism is really this idea that we have to observe phenomenon before we can explain them. Really, empiricism is the basis of our modern-day scientific method, right? We have to observe a phenomenon, come up with a theory, then sort of test that theory through observation before we reach conclusions. Empiricism was really, in many ways, made popular by this gentleman, Sir Francis Bacon. And in fact, Sir Francis Bacon is known in some quarters as the father of empiricism. Now, what Bacon really did, ladies and gentlemen, is he created a tone that kind of was very conducive to scientific work. Bacon believed that science held the capability to make life better for everyone. In a sense, he had a very modern outlook on science because his outlook was very much like that we have today, that science can sort of improve everyone's standard of living and can make life better. Bacon believed that Europeans had to stop looking to the past, that there was a lot going on in the present, that present-day Europeans had a lot of skills and things that they could teach, and he felt that present-day Europeans should have a little bit more confidence in themselves and sort of use this new science to make life better for everyone. So in fact, Bacon wrote a book called the Novum Organum, in which he sort of describes his concept of empiricism and how science can improve life for everyone. Becomes very popular, one of the leading texts of the scientific revolution. Now, one of the big concepts is who is supporting all of this new science? Now, some of this was actually done by governments. For example, kings and queens. They began to recognize the value of science, especially, for example, its military applications, that you could use science to aim artillery and for military engineering and things like that. So some of this was done by governments. Some of it was done by wealthy people, like the Medici, for example, who sponsored Galileo. But an awful lot of the new scientific knowledge was sponsored by universities around Europe, and especially by private scientific societies. For example, the Royal Society of London. And various of these scientific institutions were founded around Europe, and they promoted the discovery of new scientific advancements. Now, of course, this was a man's world in many ways, and of course, this also applied to science. Women were generally not considered to be fit for scientific inquiry. In fact, very few women at this time sort of received any type of advanced education, but there were a few women who really did make a mark. Margaret Cavendish was an English woman who was married to a lord who was a member of the Royal Society of London. In fact, she was the only woman who was actually ever invited to a meeting of the Royal Society. She was quite well educated, and in fact, she would debate with various scientists of the day, and in fact, she wrote several works that were popularizing science of the time. Maria Kunitz was an astronomer who worked with her husband and in fact wrote a book about astronomy. Now, unfortunately for her, many believe that she didn't write it, and her husband, in fact, had to put a preface in the book essentially saying that, yes, my wife did write this book. Maria Winkelmann was another female astronomer who, in fact, discovered a comet. She did this actually in 1702. However, she was not given credit for the discovery until 1930. So unfortunately, she was not around to see that she was given credit for this discovery. Now, of course, there's this question of science and religion, and we often have this image of religion sort of working very hard to discredit science and things like that. Now, as in a lot of things, this picture is only partially correct. Now, many people think of Galileo facing the Inquisition as an example of the church kind of crushing this new scientific learning. Truth is probably a little bit more involved in that. The church had, in fact, given Galileo permission to discuss Copernican theories, a heliocentric universe, as a theory. So the church had, in fact, told Galileo that he could discuss these theories. However, they just simply asked that he present them as a theory only. Now, when Galileo wrote his book on Copernican theories and the heliocentric universe, he actually went out of his way to insult the Pope. Pope Urban VIII at the time made the Pope sound to be very stupid and very slow-witted. And this, probably more than anything, is what made the church angry. Not so much that Galileo was discussing heliocentric theories, but rather that Galileo had sort of gone out of his way to insult the Pope. In a sense, Galileo had bit the hand. So when Galileo did face the Inquisition and was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life, it may have had more to do with the fact that he had angered the Pope through humiliating him than it had to do with the church trying to crush new scientific learning. Right, now, Blaise Pascal was a French mathematician who actually tried to reconcile this concept of science and religion. He very famously came up with something called Pascal's wager. Now, although Pascal was a mathematician, he actually believed that religion had a purpose, that he thought that it made people feel better psychologically. And he also thought religion had a moral benefit, because it was encouraging people to behave themselves and be good and things like that. So Pascal actually came up with something very famous called Pascal's wager. Essentially what he said is that you're better off believing in God, because if you're right and you die and go to heaven, you will have eternity in paradise. Now, if it turns out that God isn't real, he doesn't exist, well, then you really haven't lost anything, have you? However, if you don't believe in God, and you're wrong that God does exist, well, then your soul will spend eternity in hell. So basically what Pascal told people is that the safest route, the lowest cost route, was to actually believe in the existence of God. Now in England, they attempted to reconcile religion and science through something called physico-theology. It was this concept that sort of God had created nature, and that through the study of nature, through the scientific study of nature, we could come to understand the nature of God. This is what they called physico-theology. This also led to a religious belief called deism. Essentially, the concept behind deism is that God had sort of created the universe, and then he kind of stepped aside and allowed it to run. A very popular sort of deist concept was that God was like a divine watchmaker, that he had created this very intricate machine, and once he had started it running, he sort of stepped back and allowed it to do its thing. In fact, a lot of our leading founding fathers were of the deist philosophy. They actually followed this belief of God as sort of a grand watchmaker building the universe and then allowing it to run. So this kind of tries to reconcile science and religion, essentially by saying that science allows us to come closer to God through understanding the universe that he has created. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is important to remember that a lot of the changes we've discussed were happening among the elite, the very highly educated, and a very good example of this is the fact that witch hunts during this time period were quite popular throughout European popular culture. The elite and the educated may have been believing in science, but the masses were still sort of mired in superstition and paganism and things like that. In fact, between about 1400 and 1700, it's estimated that 70 to 100,000 Europeans were put to death as witches. The vast majority, over 80%, were women, mostly over the age of 40. Now this is clearly a sign that scientific knowledge still had to sort of seep down to the lower ranks of society. Now by about 1700, the witch hunts began to become to an end. There was a sense that these things had sort of gotten too out of hand, and also, of course, the new advancing scientific knowledge gradually put an end to these beliefs, just sort of bringing the witch hunts to an end. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I do hope you enjoyed this episode of Rams History. So if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. And we'll see you again soon for another episode of Rams History.